The engine coughed once, then fell silent. Dust drifted through the broken windows of the old barn as Ethan Carter rested both hands on the cracked steering wheel. The faded green tractor had not moved in nearly 20 years, yet he sat there as if it might carry him somewhere that no road could reach. Outside, a pickup truck rolled into the yard. Two men stepped out, their boots crunching over loose gravel. One looked toward the barn and laughed. "I can't believe he still kept that thing." "It'll cost more to haul away than it's worth." Ethan heard every word. He didn't answer. Instead, his thumb brushed across a small brass plate bolted beneath the steering wheel. Years of dirt covered most of it, but one tiny corner still caught the afternoon light. His grandfather had touched that same plate every single time he parked the tractor. Only once had he said why. Some things look ordinary until someone knows where to look. Back then, Ethan had been 12 years old. He thought it was just another one of Grandpa Walter's strange sayings. Now standing alone after the funeral, those words refused to leave his mind. The wind pushed the barn door open another few inches. Somewhere nearby, an old chain tapped softly against a wooden post. The sound filled the silence. A voice called from outside. "Ethan?" He climbed down slowly. The taller man removed his hat. "Sorry about your grandfather." "Thank you." The man nodded toward the tractor. "If you're selling the property, we'll take that junk off your hands, save you the trouble." Ethan looked back at the faded machine. Its tires had sunk halfway into the dirt floor. Rust covered the fenders. A family of birds had built a nest beneath the seat. It truly looked worthless. "I'll think about it," Ethan replied. The men exchanged quick smiles before climbing back into their truck. As the engine disappeared down the road, Ethan noticed something strange. Neither man had asked about the house. Neither cared about the land. They had come only for the tractor. That thought stayed with him long after the dust settled. As evening arrived, golden light spilled across the fields. Rows of dry corn leaned gently in the breeze. The farm had once been alive with people, machines, and laughter. Now only the wind seemed to remember those days. Inside the house, Ethan opened the kitchen drawer where Grandpa Walter kept important papers, tax receipts, old photographs, seed catalogs, nothing unusual. Until a folded envelope slipped onto the floor. Across the front, written in careful blue ink, were 4 simple words, "For when you wonder." His heartbeat slowed. The envelope had no stamp, no date, only his name. He opened it carefully. Inside rested a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. "If you're reading this, someone has already offered to buy the tractor." Ethan froze. He looked through the kitchen window toward the dark barn. The tractor stood exactly where it always had. He continued reading. "Don't believe the first person who tells you what it's worth. Nothing else. No explanation, no signature, just those 2 sentences. He read them again, then again. Questions crowded his mind. Why would Grandpa expect strangers to ask about an old tractor? What made that machine so important? And why had he never explained any of it while he was alive? Night settled quietly over the farm. Unable to sleep, Ethan carried a flashlight back to the barn. The wooden doors groaned as they opened. The smell of old oil, dry hay, and damp earth surrounded him. The beam of light swept across dusty shelves filled with forgotten tools. A dented milk can, an old hammer, boxes of worn-out bolts. Everything looked untouched by time. He climbed onto the tractor once more. His flashlight landed on the brass plate beneath the steering wheel. Most of the dirt refused to come off. He wiped harder with the corner of his shirt. A few more letters appeared. Not enough to read, just enough to know there was more hidden beneath decades of grime. His phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence. It was his younger sister, Claire. "Did those buyers come by?" she asked. "Yeah, they called me too." Ethan frowned. "They found your number. They offered cash, said they'd make things easy if we sold the tractor before anyone else got involved." Before anyone else got involved, the words echoed in his mind. "Claire, did Grandpa ever say anything about it?" A pause. "Only once," she answered quietly. "What did he say?" "He told me that if anyone ever seemed too eager to buy an old machine, I should ask myself what they already know." The line went silent. Ethan looked back at the brass plate. His flashlight revealed one final detail he had never noticed before. Someone had carefully scratched a tiny star into one corner. It wasn't part of the factory design. It had been carved there by hand. And hidden inside the center of that tiny star was a number. 17. Ethan stared without blinking. It wasn't random. It was a message. But a message leading to what? Outside, headlights appeared at the end of the long dirt road. Another vehicle was slowly making its way toward the farm. The headlights moved slowly through the darkness, cutting two pale lines across the empty fields. Ethan stepped down from the tractor and switched off his flashlight. The barn fell quiet except for the soft ticking of cooling metal and the distant chirping of crickets. Vehicle stopped near the gate instead of driving into the yard. An older woman climbed out. She carried a lantern instead of using the truck's headlights. Her gray jacket swayed gently in the evening breeze as she walked toward the barn. "Ethan," she called. "Yes, I hope I'm not too late." He studied her face. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't place it. "My name is Margaret Hill," she said. "Your grandfather and I were friends for many years." Ethan relaxed only a little. "I'm sorry. I don't remember meeting you. You were very young." Her eyes drifted toward the tractor. For a moment she smiled, then the smile faded. "So, they already came." "The buyers," she nodded. "They always come first." A chill ran across Ethan's shoulders. "You knew they would." "I knew they were waiting." Margaret stepped closer to the tractor but didn't touch it. "Did Walter leave you a letter?" Ethan hesitated before pulling the folded paper from his pocket. She read only the first line and gently handed it back. "He trusted you. You know what this means. I know enough to tell you one thing." She looked directly into his eyes. "Don't let anyone take that tractor until you understand why your grandfather kept it." Before Ethan could ask another question, she reached into her coat pocket and handed him a small iron key. It was old, dark with age, and tied to a faded leather string. "He told me to give you this when the time was right." "What does it open?" "I honestly don't know," she smiled softly. "He never told me." The answer sounded true. Margaret turned toward her truck. "One more thing." Ethan waited. "Look beneath what everyone else looks at." Then she disappeared into the night. For several minutes, Ethan stood alone, turning the tiny key over in his hand. It wasn't shaped like a house key. The end was unusually flat, almost as if it belonged to a small hidden compartment. He climbed back onto the tractor. The brass plate caught his attention again, the tiny carved star. The number 17, the old key, somehow they belonged together. He brushed away more dirt with an old cloth from the toolbox beside the seat. Little by little, more letters appeared on the brass plate. Not a serial number, not a company logo. A sentence. Most of it was still hidden, but he could clearly read 3 words. "Never underneath fear." It made no sense. He reached for a screwdriver lying nearby and carefully loosened the 2 small screws holding the plate in place. One screw turned easily. The second refused. Rust had locked it tight. After several tries, the screwdriver slipped, scraping across Ethan's knuckles. A thin line of blood appeared. He sighed and leaned back. "Nothing works the first time," he whispered, remembering another lesson Grandpa Walter used to repeat whenever a repair became difficult. Instead of forcing it, Ethan searched the shelves until he found a small can of penetrating oil. He sprayed the stubborn screw and waited. The silence inside the barn felt heavier now. Every shadow seemed to be watching. His phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't Claire. It was an unknown number. He answered carefully. "Hello? We heard you're keeping the tractor." The voice was calm. "We're prepared to double our offer." Ethan frowned. "You don't even know what I want for it." "We're willing to pay $50,000. His breath caught. $50,000 for a machine that barely looked worth scrap metal. "Why?" A short pause. "Because we'd rather save you the trouble." The line went dead. Ethan stared at his phone. No company name, no explanation, just an offer that made even less sense than before. He returned to the tractor and tried the screw again. This time it turned, slowly, carefully. The brass plate lifted away from the steering column. Behind it wasn't solid metal. There was a narrow, hollow space. Inside rested a tightly rolled piece of yellowed paper wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Ethan's pulse quickened. With steady hands, he unfolded the cloth. The paper was old but perfectly dry. Across the top, written in his grandfather's handwriting, were 7 words. "Only continue when you find number 17. Ethan looked from the paper to the tiny star carved into the brass plate. He had found number 17. But the note continued with only one more sentence. "The next answer isn't in the tractor. It's where the tractor first earned its scars." Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward the faded scratches running along one side of the old machine. He had always assumed they came from years of hard work. Now he wasn't so sure. Somewhere on this farm, those scars had a story, and someone else seemed determined to find it before he did. Morning arrived with a thin layer of fog covering the fields. The first light of the sun turned every drop of dew into tiny sparks, but Ethan barely noticed. His eyes stayed fixed on the long scratches running across the tractor's left side. He reached out and traced them with his fingers. The marks were deep, too deep for ordinary farm work. His grandfather had once laughed whenever Ethan asked about them. "Every scar has a story," he would say. "The important ones don't get told too early." Back then, Ethan thought he was avoiding the question. Now it felt like another clue. He grabbed an old photograph from the house before walking back outside. It showed Grandpa Walter sitting proudly on the same tractor nearly 40 years earlier. Behind him stood a large oak tree beside a stone fence. Ethan looked across the farm. The fence was still there. The oak tree wasn't. Only a weathered stump remained near the edge of the north field. He folded the photograph into his jacket pocket and started walking. The grass brushed against his boots, still wet from the morning dew. Birds circled overhead while the wind carried the smell of fresh earth. Every few steps he stopped, comparing the picture with the land in front of him. When he reached the old stump, he noticed something unusual. The ground nearby wasn't level. It dipped slightly, forming a shallow path leading toward a forgotten corner of the property where tall weeds had taken over. No one had walked there in years. Ethan followed it anyway. The weeds scratched against his jeans as he pushed forward. Hidden beneath them, pieces of rusty fencing and broken farm tools appeared one after another, almost swallowed by the earth. Then he saw it. A narrow wooden bridge stretched across a dry creek bed. Half of it had collapsed. The remaining boards looked ready to give way. His grandfather had always warned him to stay away from this side of the farm. He never explained why. Ethan stepped carefully onto the bridge. Each board groaned beneath his weight. Halfway across, he froze. Long grooves were carved into the weathered wood. They matched the width of the scratches on the tractor. His heart pounded. This was where it had happened. He crossed the rest of the bridge and climbed the opposite bank. A rusted metal sign leaned against a rock. Most of the paint had disappeared, but one word remained clear: Mill Road. He had never heard anyone mention a mill. The road ended only a few yards ahead at the ruins of an old stone building. Ivy covered most of its walls, and the roof had collapsed long ago. Inside, broken beams lay scattered across the floor. Sunlight poured through the empty windows, filling the room with floating dust. Ethan walked slowly, listening to the silence. Near the back wall, he found old machine parts, wooden barrels, and a cracked workbench. Nothing looked valuable. Then something caught his eye. A fresh boot print. Someone had been here recently. The dirt around it was still loose. He crouched beside it. It wasn't his. It wasn't decades old. It had been made within the last day. A cold feeling settled in his chest. Someone else was following the same trail. He searched the room more carefully. Behind the broken workbench lay a small metal box covered with dirt and leaves. He tried opening it. Locked, his hand slipped into his pocket, the iron key. He stared at it for a second before sliding it into the lock. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked open. Inside wasn't money. There wasn't jewelry. There wasn't gold. Only a leather notebook wrapped in cloth. The cover was worn smooth from years of use. Across the front were 2 initials burned into the leather: W.C. Walter Carter. Ethan opened the first page. His grandfather's handwriting filled every line, but instead of stories or farm records, the pages contained dates, names, rough sketches, and careful notes about the tractor. One sentence stood alone in the middle of the page. Never let them separate the tractor from its history. Before Ethan could turn another page, he heard gravel crunch outside. He closed the notebook instantly. Voices drifted through the broken doorway. "Search the back first. There has to be something here." Ethan's breathing slowed. He slipped behind a fallen beam as two men entered the mill. They were the same buyers who had visited the farm. One carried a flashlight, the other unfolded an old map. "You think the grandson figured it out?" one asked. The other shook his head. "Not yet. And if he has?" The taller man smiled without humor. "Then we buy the tractor today, before he discovers what makes it valuable." Ethan tightened his grip on the notebook. For the first time, he realized they weren't chasing the tractor because of what it was. They were chasing it because of what it could lead them to. As the men searched only a few feet away, Ethan noticed something tucked inside the notebook's back cover. It was another folded photograph. This one showed his grandfather standing beside the tractor. With three other men Ethan had never seen before, all four were smiling. But someone had carefully cut one face out of the picture. Only an empty space remained. Whoever had removed it wanted that person forgotten or hidden. And suddenly the mystery wasn't just about an old tractor anymore. It was about the missing man no one wanted Ethan to find. Ethan waited until the two men disappeared deeper into the ruined mill before he moved. Every step felt louder than it should. A loose stone rolled beneath his boot, but the voices outside covered the sound. He slipped through a narrow opening in the back wall and hurried toward the dry creek. Only when the old mill was hidden behind the trees did he stop to catch his breath. The leather notebook was still clutched tightly in his hands. He opened it again. This time he turned the pages slowly. Most of them described ordinary repairs, harvest dates, and weather notes. Then the writing changed. His grandfather had started recording names. Not customers, not neighbors, collectors. Each name had a short note beside it. Asked too many questions. Only cared about the plate. Never let him drive it. The final name had no note, only a single black line drawn through it. Ethan frowned. Why would Grandpa keep a list of people interested in the tractor for so many years? He kept reading until a folded newspaper clipping slipped from between the pages. The headline was faded but still readable. Local farmer helps save historic prototype from scrapyard. The article was almost impossible to read after so many years, but one sentence stood out. The experimental tractor was believed to have disappeared shortly after field testing in the late 1960s. Experimental. Ethan looked up at the old machine sitting in his mind. Could that rusty tractor have been more than an ordinary farm vehicle? He folded the clipping and hurried back toward the farmhouse. Claire's car was already parked outside. She stepped onto the porch the moment she saw him. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." He handed her the newspaper clipping. She read it twice. "This can't be our tractor." "I thought the same thing." She looked toward the barn. "If it really is, why didn't Grandpa tell us? I think he was protecting something. Or someone." Neither of them spoke for a few moments. The wind moved gently through the trees. Then Claire remembered something. There was another box. Ethan turned quickly. "What box?" "In Grandpa's bedroom. I thought we searched everything." "We searched the drawers." She pointed toward the old wardrobe. "We never checked underneath it." Within minutes they were upstairs. The heavy wardrobe barely moved at first. Together they pushed harder until it slid across the wooden floor with a long scrape. Hidden beneath it was a square trapdoor. Dust covered the edges. It hadn't been opened in years. Ethan pulled the iron ring. The wooden door lifted slowly. A narrow ladder disappeared into darkness. Claire switched on a flashlight. "I'll go first," Ethan whispered. The basement was smaller than he expected. Stone walls surrounded a single wooden table. On top rested an old metal toolbox. Unlike every other tool on the farm, this one looked almost new. No rust, no dust, as if Grandpa had opened it not long before he died. Ethan carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay dozens of photographs, blueprints, letters, and one official-looking document inside a plastic sleeve. Across the top were large printed words. Confidential field test program. Claire looked over his shoulder. This was government property. Ethan turned another page. The document described a small number of prototype tractors built for testing before mass production. Most had been dismantled. One was listed as status missing. The serial number caught Ethan's eye immediately. It matched the faded numbers on the brass plate beneath Grandpa's tractor. Claire covered her mouth. So Grandpa knew all along. Before Ethan could answer, a loud engine echoed outside. Another vehicle, then another. He rushed upstairs and looked through the front window. 3 black SUVs had stopped at the entrance to the farm. Men in clean jackets stepped out, not the buyers from before. These men carried folders instead of tools. One of them walked calmly to the front porch and knocked. 3 slow knocks. Ethan opened the door only halfway. The man smiled politely. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes, my name is Daniel Brooks." He held up an identification card. "We've been searching for your grandfather's tractor for many years." Ethan remained silent. Daniel continued. "We're not here to pressure you." "Then why are you here?" "Because we've learned someone else already has." Ethan thought of the 2 buyers. Daniel noticed the expression on his face. "They've contacted you." "Yes, they're private collectors." "What do they want?" Daniel looked toward the barn. "The tractor itself isn't the real prize." "What is?" "The engineering hidden inside it." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Daniel lowered his voice. "Your grandfather made one change before he hid that machine." "What kind of change?" "We don't know." "Then how do you know it's there?" Daniel reached into his folder and removed an old black and white photograph. It showed the tractor during its testing years. At first glance, it looked identical. Then Ethan noticed one small difference. The brass plate beneath the steering wheel was completely different. Someone had replaced it. His grandfather. Daniel met Ethan's eyes. "Whatever Walter Carter hid behind that plate," he paused, "is the reason people have been looking for this tractor for over 30 years. At that exact moment, the sound of tires racing across gravel came from the back of the farm. The 2 buyers had returned. This time, they weren't alone. The roar of engines shattered the quiet afternoon. Ethan looked through the kitchen window as 2 pickup trucks raced across the back field, throwing dust high into the air. The same men who had offered cash for the tractor jumped out before the vehicles had even stopped. Daniel Brooks stepped off the porch and quietly closed the folder in his hands. "Stay behind me," he said. Ethan shook his head. "No." He looked toward the old barn where his grandfather's tractor had rested for decades. "This started with my family. It ends with my family." The 2 collectors walked forward with forced smiles. "We're done making offers," the taller man said. "We'll pay $100,000 right now." Ethan didn't answer. The man glanced at the barn. "You don't even know what you're protecting." Ethan looked him in the eye. "Then why are you willing to pay that much for it?" The smile disappeared. For the first time, neither man had an answer. Daniel stepped forward. "The tractor is legally his. If you have no business here, it's time to leave." The collectors exchanged a look. Without another word, they turned and walked back toward their trucks, but before climbing inside, the taller man looked over his shoulder. "When you finally discover what's hidden in it, you'll wish you had taken the money." The trucks disappeared down the road, leaving only silence behind. That evening, Ethan, Claire, and Daniel rolled the tractor into the center of the barn. Sunlight slipped through the old wooden walls, filling the air with floating dust. Daniel placed the black and white photograph beside the tractor. "The replacement brass plate is the only thing that doesn't belong to the original machine," he said. Ethan carefully removed the plate once again. Behind it, the narrow compartment was empty except for one small metal pin that had gone unnoticed before. He gently pulled it. A soft click echoed inside the steering column. Everyone froze. Another click followed. Then a hidden panel beneath the dashboard slowly slid open. Inside rested a flat steel case wrapped in waxed cloth. No one spoke. Ethan lifted it with both hands. It was surprisingly heavy. He placed it on the workbench and carefully opened the latches. Inside were dozens of perfectly preserved engineering drawings, handwritten notes, and several official documents carrying government seals. But one item rested alone in the center. A small leather notebook, not his grandfather's, someone else's. The first page was signed by a young engineer named Thomas Avery. His final note was short. "Walter, if you're reading this, they decided to destroy everything. Thank you for believing our work deserved another chance." Daniel slowly exhaled. Thomas Avery disappeared before the project ended. Claire looked at Ethan. So Grandpa wasn't hiding treasure. Ethan smiled softly. He was protecting someone's life work. The engineering drawings described fuel-saving designs that had never reached production. Simple ideas that were years ahead of their time. They weren't just valuable because they were rare. They told the story of people whose work had almost been erased from history. Weeks later, historians confirmed the documents were authentic. The prototype tractor was one of the last surviving examples from the forgotten testing program. Museums, universities, and collectors all wanted to display it. The offers became larger than Ethan had ever imagined, but he remembered his grandfather's words. Some things look ordinary until someone knows where to look. He finally understood. The tractor had never been about money. It had always been about memory. Months later, the restored tractor stood inside a local agricultural museum. Beside it hung a photograph of Grandpa Walter, smiling exactly as he had in the old picture Ethan found on the first day. The display told visitors how one farmer refused to let history disappear. At the bottom of the exhibit sat the worn brass plate. Next to it was a small card. The original owner replaced this plate to protect the people behind the machine, not the machine itself. Children stopped to read it. Older farmers stood quietly, remembering days spent in fields much like Walter's. One afternoon, Ethan noticed a young boy staring at the tractor. "It doesn't look like it's worth much," the boy said. Ethan smiled. "I used to think the same thing." The boy looked up. "So, what made it so valuable?" Ethan rested his hand gently on the faded green hood. "It carried a story that almost disappeared." The boy nodded, even if he didn't fully understand. As Ethan walked toward the museum doors, he slipped Grandpa Walter's letter back into his pocket. The paper had become worn from being folded and unfolded so many times. It no longer felt like a clue. It felt like a thank you. Outside, the evening sun stretched across the fields beyond the museum. For a moment, Ethan could almost hear the slow rumble of the old tractor crossing the farm once again, carrying not just crops, but the quiet promise that some things are worth protecting even when the world believes they have no value. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't hidden because they're expensive. They're hidden because they're important. If this story reminded you that every ordinary thing may hold an extraordinary story, I'd love for you to join me again for the next journey. Until then, take care, and keep looking a little closer at the things everyone else overlooks.